So good to see all of you back out tonight, as I mentioned just a few moments ago. You know, Brother Hugh mentioned this morning that the two topics that Jesus talked the most about were hell and money. And I'm not going to go back over what he said this morning, but you know, I think that should tell us something. In that, you know, those are probably a couple of subjects that we need to teach on a little bit more. And, you know, I know preachers kind of have this, they kind of hesitate sometimes to talk about money because the congregation might think that they're trying to get more of it. But, you know, it's an important subject because, as Hugh said this morning, money is a very huge temptation. The pursuit of it, or the having of it, can, as the Bible says, lead us into all kinds of snares and evils and lead us into places that we don't need to go. And so, you know, probably at least once a year is a good time to talk about money. But the subject tonight, I think, is another one that we need to talk about probably more than we do, and that's the way that we use our words, the way that we communicate. And especially, I think, the way we communicate with those who are not Christians. Because, and we'll get more into this as we go through the lesson, but, you know, opportunities can be won and lost with a word. And so it's very important that we use our words wisely, that we communicate wisely, especially when we're talking to those outside of Christ, and we want them to have the same blessings that we have. And so that's kind of where we're going with this tonight is what are some ways or how can we use our communication wisely? How can we talk to people maybe in the best way to be a good influence on them? And Brother Curtis read for us the main text that we're going to be kind of jumping off from tonight, and that's over in Colossians, the 4th chapter. And he read verses 2 through 6, but the main verse that we're concerned with, or that we're going to really kind of focus on tonight, is chapter 4 and verse 6, where Paul says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." And so in the context here, Paul is discussing open doors to preach the gospel. He's talking about talking to the lost. And, you know, also he's discussing setting a proper example to, as he says in verse 5, those who are outside. Again, we're talking about non-Christians here. And in the end of verse 6, more specifically, those who are outside who ask questions about our faith. When religious topics come up with people who are not Christians, how do we handle that? What is our speech like? And that's what Paul is talking about here. And it's of particular interest what Paul says about our speech, how he characterizes it. First of all, he says our speech is to be with grace. Okay? And, you know, I think most of us who've been in the church for a long time know the stock answer when we say, well, what does grace mean? It means unmerited favor. Well, that's not the kind of grace that Paul is talking about here, because another definition of faith is just means that it is something that is beneficial for someone. So when Paul says, let your speech be with grace, he's saying, whatever you say, let it be beneficial for the person who hears it. Let it be for their good. That's the sense of the word that he's using here. And then he also says your speech should be seasoned with salt. And again, this is where the common vernacular kind of gets us a little bit confused here, because when we say somebody's speech is salty today, that's not a compliment. When we say somebody's speech is salty, that means they probably talk in a way they ought not to. But that's not the way Paul uses it here. And you think about what does salt do? Well, it enhances or improves the flavor of whatever it's added to. So when our speech is seasoned with salt, that means it should enhance the situation, not make it worse. And also, salt in Paul's day was used as a preservative. So it was used to guard against spoilage and rot. So when Paul says, let your speech be seasoned with salt, he's saying, don't spoil the situation by what you say. Rather, preserve the situation and make it better. So, when Paul says, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, what's he saying? Make sure what you're saying is beneficial or for the good of the one who hears you, and make sure that what you say is not rotten or spoiled, that it doesn't portray the opposite of the life that we're claiming to live. That's what it means. And again, why? Why does Paul talk about that specifically here? Go back up to verse 5. He says, walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. And he's just asked them to pray for an open door to preach to the lost. And he's reminding them, hey, not only do I, Paul, have a responsibility to the lost, but every one of you Colossians, and I'm going to extend it out, every one of you members of the Green Meadow Church of Christ have a responsibility to those who are outside, to the lost. And so, with a lot of people, we have very limited opportunities to share the gospel with them. And so if we waste those opportunities by, speaking inappropriately, who knows if we've let slip by the only chance that we're ever going to have a positive influence or a positive impact on that person. So this is why it's so important that we be wise in our communication with others. And so I'm just going to offer 3 ways tonight that we can be wise in our communication with people. And the first way is that we be discerning in what we say and how we say it. And the word discernment just really means analyzing and recognizing the situation and behaving in a certain way based on that information. Okay? We're going to look at the situation, we're going to recognize kind of what's going on, and then we're going to speak in such a way that is based on what we have observed and what we have heard. And, the idea of discernment is one that is fairly common in the New Testament. Over in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus talks about how the Pharisees were able to discern based on what the sky was doing. They were able to discern what the weather was going to be like. They would look at the sky, and if it was a certain color, then they knew certain weather was coming. If it was a different color, they knew another type of weather was coming. And so he talks about them discerning the weather, being able to look at the circumstances and discern what they needed to do. It's the same way with our speech. We need to understand the circumstance. We need to look at the signs, so to speak, and then see how we ought to speak based on that situation. And over in Hebrews, the 5th chapter, I want to read this one because it kind of plays into what we're talking about here. But in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 12, the Hebrew writer says, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you've come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full of age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil." And so what the Hebrew writer here is saying is, we've got to spend enough time in the Word to be able to know good from evil, to be able to discern good from evil. Because if all we're focused on in the Word is basic things, we're never going to be able to discern the fine lines between good and evil. And it's the same with our speech with other people. We need to really learn to kind of get to know people and to read the signs about what's going on in order to be able to respond in a proper and discerning way and not lose an opportunity. And we're going to come back to these in just a minute and kind of make some application. But, let's get these three out of the way first. The second way that we can be wise in our communication is to be discreet. Okay, use discretion. And this, I'll be honest, I could not find this specific word ever used in the New Testament, but the principle is there. The principle of discretion is there. You know what discretion, at least as far as our speech, really means? It means knowing when to speak and knowing when to shut up. That's really what it means. When to speak and when to be silent. That's what it means to be discreet. And I said that the word discretion is not ever used in the New Testament, but if you've ever read the book of Proverbs, discretion is all over the book of Proverbs, especially as it pertains to the way to what a person says. Over in Proverbs, the 15th chapter, we're going to read three different Proverbs here. But over in Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 2, he says, "The tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of the fool pours forth foolishness." The wise person knows what to say and when to say it, and they know when not to say anything at all. But the fool just runs over at the mouth, is what the proverb writer. Go back one chapter to chapter 14 and verse 3. "In the mouth of the fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve them." So again, the fool wants you to see how smart he is. And usually when he opens his mouth, he just proves what a greater fool he is. And that's what he's telling us here. Knowing when to speak and when not to speak. You could say in that same chapter, and look at verses 7 and 8. "Go from the presence of a foolish man when you do not perceive in him the lips of knowledge. The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit." And one more over in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. "In the multitudes of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." That's discretion. Knowing when to say something, knowing when not to say something. Using discretion means that we know when it's better to be silent or when it is better to wait for a more opportune time to address a subject. And here's just kind of an example of what we're talking about. If you're having a discussion with somebody in a room full of people and kind of a really sensitive subject comes up, between you and one other person in a room full of people, a room full of people may not be the best place to discuss that. Hey, can we get together later just the two of us and talk about this? Because you may embarrass them. You may drive them away. So, sometimes we just need to ask for a more opportune time to address a subject. And to me, this really includes making sure that we really understand a person's perspective and understanding on something before we come to a conclusion about what they believe. Because have you ever had somebody say to you, "Oh, you people from the Church of Christ, you think you're the only ones going to heaven"? Heard that a time or two. Because a lot of people don't know what my perspective is. They don't know what my understanding of that is. But it's just it's a blanket statement. That's a lack of discretion when you just make a blanket statement about somebody's faith just because they may be affiliated with a certain religion, and you say, "All y'all people believe this." Well, it might not be what they believe. And so that's a lack of discretion. First, we need to listen. Listen before we speak. That's kind of what discretion is all about. And then thirdly, we just need to be observant and attentive. And again, this goes back to what I just said. A lot of times we have a tendency to open our mouth before we hear what a person has to say. We're thinking about what our answer is going to be while they're in mid-sentence, rather than listening, being observant and attentive. And this is just kind of the Bible does use a word that kind of gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. And it's a big word. I don't like to use it too much. But it's the word circumspection. Okay? But observant and attentive is what being circumspect is all about. It just means you kind of look at something all the way around just so that you'll know the proper way to approach it, the proper way to go, or the proper words to speak. And so if you look over in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 8, Matthew chapter 2, and this is just kind of going with the idea of what we're talking about here. When Herod met the wise men and they were looking for the baby Jesus, and look what Herod said in verse 8 to the wise men of Matthew chapter 2. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the young child. When you have found him, bring back word to me, and I may come and worship him also." The phrase there, "go and search diligently," that's the idea. That's what really look hard, really study hard to find where Jesus is. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about being observant and attentive before we speak. It's just carefully, diligently looking at things before we speak and knowing the best way. And over in Ephesians chapter 5, and again, this is just, we're talking about being observant and attentive. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, he says, "Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, for it's shameful even to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. But all things that are exposed are made manifest by the light. For whatever makes manifest is light. Therefore," he says, "awake you who sleep, rise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. See that you walk," there's our word, "circumspectly, not as fools, but wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil." So he's talking about avoiding evil. We're talking about being circumspect in our speech. Speak circumspectly, redeeming the time. Be observant, listen, be attentive before you speak so that you can answer appropriately. And so, what are some areas then where we really need these things? We need discernment, we need discretion, we need observation and attentiveness. And before we get to those areas here, I want to make this kind of clear. I'm not just talking about the spoken word here. because of our communication nowadays is not done face to face. It's not done with my voice speaking into your ear. It's done with my iPhone texting your iPhone and using all kinds of weird little pictures to go along with that, emojis. So much of our communication today is from my social media account to your social media account. And so when we're talking about speech here, I'm not talking about just our spoken word, but because we live in a society where we communicate as much or more electronically than we do verbally, that's what we're talking about here. Any type of communication. And believe me, it's a lot harder to get your point across the way it should be electronically than it is verbally. So we have to be extra careful in what we say when we communicate electronically. So, where do we need to be discerning and discreet and observant and attentive? And y'all may see this and you're going to say, what? When it comes to profanity. Now, I'm not saying that I think any of us has a problem with profanity. I hope not. But what I can say is that I know that if you're a person who used to talk that way, it's kind of like alcoholism or addiction or anything like that. It's really hard to completely get rid of it. Even up here, even if it's just up here. So hopefully we don't have this problem. But if we do, and I know our kids are bombarded with it all the time at school. But let me tell you, if you're in the workplace, I know you're bombarded by it there too. I am. And I know pretty much everywhere. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in just a minute. But there was a quote that I heard when I was, a young teenager about profanity that I've never forgotten. And it said that profanity is the feeble attempt of a weak mind to forcefully express itself. And that has always stuck with me. And I've always believed that till now. Because I don't believe that that's why some people only use profanity. I think some people use profanity because that's what they've grown up with. That is all they've ever heard. I hear parents with their very small children unleash streams of profanity at those children. Not even necessarily in a hateful way, it's just the way they... And so those kids are growing up to think that that's the way you talk. I have coworkers that I work with that I love dearly, and I think the world of them, but, and this is the way they talk because this is what they know. They think this is normal. And it is the norm in our society. But I grew up in a different era. Because I can remember as a very young child of about 5 or 6, we were sitting in our dining room one night having supper. And next door to us, there were some men working on the roof. They were replacing the roof. And they were being very loud, and they were using a whole lot of words that I'd never heard before. But my dad had heard them before, and he knew what they were saying. And I will never forget what my dad did. He got up from the table, went out onto our back porch, and just kind of called across to those guys, "Hey, fellas, we've got women and children over here in our dining room, and we can hear what you're saying. Could you please watch your language?" He wasn't mean about it. And they apologized. And they did what he asked them to do. So, there was a time when, at least around women and children, you didn't use that kind, but now we got women and children using that kind of language. So this is how much our society has changed. But what does the New Testament say about the use of this kind of language? Back over in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, I know I checked these. I checked these references. Oh, there it is, 29. I was looking at 28, but 29. Paul says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart," there's our word again, "grace to the hearers." When does profanity ever impart grace to anybody? It just doesn't. It doesn't. And so it's, in the context here, Paul is talking about participating in the sins of the other Gentiles. And so he's telling them these things that they ought not to do anymore. And he says, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. And the corrupt communication would certainly include profanity. And go over a chapter to chapter 5 and verse 4. And again, Paul says, let's look at verse 3. "But fornication, all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which is not fitting, but rather a giving of thanks." And so again, the filthy talk and the coarse jesting, that would fall under this. And then one more over in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8. "You must all put off all of these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, and filthy language out of your mouth." So there's our profanity. So the scripture is very clear that profanity does not have any place in the vocabulary of the Christian. So let's go back to our 3 words again then. Let's talk about being discerning. Do we know the difference between profanity and not profanity? I hope we do, but again, it's become so common in our language today that sometimes our kids don't know the difference. You ever had one of your kids just out of the blue just say a curse word because they didn't know what it meant? It's just it's what their friends say. But we need to know. We need to know the difference between profanity and that which is useful for edification, for building people up, for being beneficial in our speech to others. And what about being discreet? And again, I know, and I can say I know this firsthand because I hear this kind of language all the time in the workplace. And I've never told anybody this, but there was a time when I had a serious problem with using this kind of language. There's a time in my life when and as I said, that's a temptation that never goes away. And when you're around it all the time, you know how much greater the temptation is? But we have to ask ourselves, is my using that type of language going to help or hurt the cause of Christ among my coworkers, my fellow students, among my brethren? Or do I need to find a better way to express myself? Or be on extra guard if that's been an issue for me, that I don't ever use that kind of language. Especially not if I'm trying to have an influence on those who are outside. And then there's this idea of being observant and attentive. Do we consider all of the ramifications of the use of profanity on our souls and on the souls of others? Again, we may have limited opportunities with some people, and if we let a word slip, but we claim to be God's people, that's going to raise some eyebrows. That may destroy an opportunity. But let me flip the coin over just a minute, and I'm going to give you an example of this. But have I considered how avoiding the use of profanity can have an influence on other people? I'll give you an example. And again, it's a personal example because it's the best one I can think of right off the top of my head. But at my workplace, I kind of have started doing a little bit of graphic design, designing T-shirts and stickers and stuff for people. I'll just give them to them as gifts. Well, one of my coworkers here several weeks ago, she had seen some stickers that I had made for somebody else, and she said, "Oh, I'd love for you to make some stickers for me." And I said, "Well, what would you like on the sticker?" And so she told me, and part of the message was a curse word. And she said, "Oh, but that has a curse word on it. So if you're not comfortable with that, that's okay." And I said, "Really not comfortable with that? No problem." Do you know why that even came up? Because none of my coworkers has ever heard me use those kinds of words. Ever. And they know, I mean, they use them all the time, and, I'm kind of that observant, attentive type. I don't get on to them about it when they do use it, but they use it a whole lot less when I'm around. So have we considered what kind of an impact avoiding profanity can have on other people? It can have a positive impact. It can have a positive, and who knows what doors that may open up later. So we need it when we're just talking in everyday talk. We need to be discerning. We need to be discreet. We need to be observant and attentive. But this is the one that really I feel like we need to hit on. And that's with our use of the gospel. Because, again, I have grown up in a generation where the gospel to the lost has not always been presented in the best way, in the most loving, observant, attentive, discreet, and discerning way. And I want to see the new generation do better than we did. And this really speaks more to how we say something than to what we say. You've heard me say this over and over, but I think too often we become more interested in winning an argument than in saving a soul. I know I have observed that with others in my life, and I've been guilty of it myself. Boy, I sure told him. But you know what? I probably ruined any opportunity that I had to talk to that person again. Too many times, I think we have had the tendency to use our words, although they are the truth, to destroy rather than to save. And we can't do that and do what the gospel is intended to do. What does the New Testament say about the use of our words in teaching others? Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 15. Actually, I'm going to, we'll just read verse 15, but we'll give you the context. Paul here says, "But speaking the truth in love, we may grow up," that is, the church may grow up in all things into Him who is the head, even Christ. And so he's talking about how the church had been given preachers and teachers and apostles and evangelists and pastors and prophets and all of these things for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, till we all come to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, verse 13, and that we should no longer be children tossed to and fro, verse 14, but that we should do this: speak the truth in love, and grow up in all things into Him who is the head, even Christ. Speak the truth. And a lot of times that's where we cut it off. Speak the truth in love. Speak the truth with discernment and discretion, having observed and been attentive to whoever you're talking to, so that you can know the best way to present the truth in love. And let me tell you that if our motivation is love in speaking the truth, the words will follow. The words will follow. If our motivation is for the salvation of the soul, if it's done out of love. And then over in Acts chapter 20 and verse 27, Paul here is giving a defense of himself, or he's kind of recounting the things that he has done. I believe it's in the church of Ephesus, if I'm not mistaken. But in chapter 20 and verse 27 of Acts, Paul says, "I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God." And so certainly there is the need to proclaim the whole counsel of God, whether it be positive or whether it be negative, whether it be Jesus talking about heaven or Jesus talking about hell. Jesus preached the whole counsel of God. But there's a proper way to proclaim it so that we don't burn bridges. At least we don't light the match. Now, it may be, and we just lost our connection. Maybe I ran it out of batteries. It may be that the person that we're talking to opts to burn the bridge. But we need to be careful not to let it be that the way we use our language to be the cause that bridge is set on fire. We can preach the whole counsel of God. We can teach the whole counsel of God. But we can do it in the proper way. You know, Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12 says that the Word of God is like a two-edged sword. It's living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing of both soul and spirit. So the Word is a sword. But we need to let the Word do the piercing. We need to let the Word do the dividing and not our tongues in the way that we present the Word. So, being discerning in our use of the gospel, do we know the difference between speaking the truth in love and speaking the truth to win an argument? It's taken me till I'm over 50 years old to learn the difference. But I'm getting there, I hope. As far as being discreet, is the way I present the truth going to help or hurt the cause of Christ among those who are outside or among my brethren? Am I discreet in the way I present the truth? And as far as observation and attentiveness goes, have I considered all the ramifications of how I speak the truth, not only on my own soul, but on the souls of others? Again, if I'm using the Bible like a hammer, that's probably not going to have a good outcome for my soul or for theirs. But if I'm using it with love. So where do we start? Where do we start to make sure that all of my communication is done wisely is done with the proper attitude, the proper heart. Well, I just gave you the answer. It starts in the heart. Jesus said over in Matthew chapter 15, I believe his disciples here were being chastised, or he was being chastised because his disciples didn't wash their hands before they ate. And so Jesus in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 17 said, "Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated, but those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man." But also, those things that come out of the heart, the words, the good words, the loving, the discerning, the discreet words, when they come out of the heart and then out of the mouth, that's when they purify rather than defile. So it starts in the heart. And Paul again said over in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever are noble, whatever are just, whatever are pure, whatever things are lovely, and whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." Because you know what happens? When we meditate on the good things come out of our mouths. The way we communicate is going to be much better. So it has to start, all of this has to start with a pure heart. So it's going to mean, and this is not easy, I'll guarantee it's not easy, that we are going to have to find a way to pull our heads and our hearts out of the filth of the world. And that is not easy. But you know, when we bury our hearts and our heads in this, it sure does go a long way. When we immerse ourselves in the Word, that's when we begin to be able to use our words the way we should, to have a positive impact on the people that we come in contact with from day to day. Well, that is all that we have for tonight. In just a few moments, we're going to sing number 326. And I'm going to say exactly what Hugh said this morning. Y'all might want to take out your songbooks because I'm not sure I can get the PowerPoint back up. So if you want to turn to number 326, here in just a few moments, Bill is going to lead us in that song. It's Trust and Obey. Do you trust in Jesus? Are you ready to obey Jesus? If you're not a Christian and you're ready tonight to confess that faith, to repent of your sins, and to be baptized, He will take away your sin. Do you trust Him enough to believe that He'll take away your sins if you obey the word that He's given? If you're a Christian and you need our help tonight, whatever it might be, we want to invite you to come and let us know how we can help as we stand and sing this invitation song.